Okay, so let's imagine you are the Australian government and you have become persuaded that you need to do something to help support science in Australia. How can you actually do this? How can you make Australia have high-tech companies, good research that solves Australian problems, a more diversified technological economy? How can you actually do this? Well, one rather boring approach is to provide infrastructure. I mean, you can't have a tech company if you don't have a good port nearby to export your goods. You need electricity, internet access, and so on. You need open markets, which Australia normally has. You need the ability to export and import what you need. And you need an educated workforce. Now, Australia has a lot of good research universities, but still we produce relatively few engineers compared to many other countries. A lot of our university graduates are going into things that don't need high technology. One issue here is the really great problem in getting good science teachers, particularly in poorer areas and more remote areas. There are large parts of the country where people abandon physics and maths in primary or high school because they can't get the good teachers, which is a big equity issue particularly for perhaps indigenous people or people from poor areas. If they don't get the good science education in high school, they don't go on to do these things at university, and they don't go on to become the billionaire tech entrepreneurs that we might want in the future. Now, another way that most governments encourage science and technology is by patent protection. A patent means that you as a company can apply for it, and if you get granted the patent, it gets checked. And if you can show that your research is new and important, you can get you a patent, which means you get an exclusive right to use it for 20 to 25 years in Australia. Now, this technique's been used for a long time. It's a sort of a deal. The government will give you exclusivity to encourage you to actually do the research in return for you actually publishing what you've done. Now, this certainly encourages some research. It's the major reason why you get research and development in biomedical or medical research, making new drugs, for example. The pharmaceutical companies, the way they make their money is they spend often the billions of dollars it takes to develop a new drug, and then the idea is they make an exclusive. Let's say it takes 10 years to develop the drug. They have the patent, they have 10 years. Then by the time the drug has finally been approved and gone through all the clinical trials, you've got another 10 or 15 years where you can charge lots of money for it and hopefully make back the billions of dollars you spent early on. In fact, for the drug companies, maybe there's an argument that these patents should go for longer. Because the clinical trials take so long, they don't necessarily have that many years after the drug is approved to make their money back. And many countries, including Australia, restrict the prices of drugs, also limiting how much money you can make back. Arguably, the rest of the world is freeloading on the US. The drugs are very expensive, and that's what allows the drug companies to invest in new drugs because they can make the money back there and the rest of the world can freeload on it. So patents can be essential, but they can also be horribly abused. You take a piece of high technology like a smartphone, there are probably tens of thousands of patents involved in this. Some patents for the different pieces of technology and for the devices that manufacture them, for the software. That means if you want to set up a new company to build smartphones, you might have to negotiate with 10,000 other companies to get rights to use it and pay them all. This is a major disincentive to come up with new technologies. In fact, it's deliberately used to talk about patent thickets. This is a whole network of interlocking patents, often owned by old companies, which make it very hard for a new company to come in. It means an old company can just say, no, you can't have access to that particular patent, and therefore stops you competing with them. In fact, what often happens is that companies accumulate the patents not to use them, but to threaten each other. So Apple might say to Google, you can't do this because we've got a patent, and Google will say, but you can't do that because we've got a patent, let's come to a deal, and they'll bargain off some sort of deal on these things. There are patent trolls. These are companies who buy up perhaps defunct companies that have gone bankrupt to get hold of their patents and then use these patents to threaten other companies. We've bought the patent from this old defunct mobile phone company, but they patent this and you're doing this, and therefore we're going to sue you unless you pay us off. And there are often patents that are totally ridiculous. For example, Amazon has a patent on the idea of pressing one button to buy something, which is not exactly a very difficult argument, a difficult idea. There was an American company that had a patent on a peanut butter and jam sandwich with no crusts, which again seems ridiculous. So patents, good and bad. Most countries have them. It's not entirely clear whether they are a net a positive for research and development. They certainly are in some fields, particularly pharmaceuticals. How about subsidies or tax breaks? This is something Australia does. If you do research and development as a private company, the government will subsidise you by reducing your tax. Probably a good idea. Evidence is that these tax breaks do mean that companies spend more on research and development. But there's also an awful lot of creative accounting that goes on, and it can be abused to reclassify other activities as research and development. So certainly a lot of that money can be abused. Or finally, there's the more straightforward approach. If you want to encourage science and technology, why not just pay people to do it? Give them some money. There are two ways this can be done, the institute model or the competitive grant model. Now, the institute model is where government might set up or fund a research institute, like CSIRO in Australia or NASA in the US. This is an institute which is paid by the government. The people who work there might be public servants, or maybe it's run through some sort of shell company. And they do research. Most countries have these things. In European countries, it tends to be the main way that research is done. For example, the Max Planck Institutes in Germany. In Australia, the US, and generally the Anglo-Saxon countries, the different model, the competitive grant model, tends to dominate. What are the benefits of this model? One benefit is you've got long-term funding. If you've set up an institute, the institute might reasonably still expect to be there 10, 20, 30 years from now, so it can embark on long-term research projects, maybe risky ones that might pay off in 10, 20 or 30 years. It's also a low overhead. Scientists don't have to spend all their time applying for money. The money just comes in a regular, predictable fashion. But there are disadvantages. One disadvantage is scientists get complacent. If you know you've got a job for life, maybe you're not as fired up to do the great research. The institutes can become very self-serving, where they tend to, their main purpose is to persuade the government to keep on funding them, and so they can maybe spend more money on lobbying the government and trying to look good to the government rather than actually doing the research. A famous quote is that NASA became the giant self-licking ice cream cone. The idea would be that NASA's main purpose is to persuade the government to keep giving money to NASA, and it does all sorts of things that actually aren't research and development, like spending money in key marginal constituencies, lobbying members of the Congress, and so on. And also these institutes can become very bureaucratic and conservative. Maybe they need to keep showing the government that they've got something. Look, the last year we've done this following research, published the following papers. Maybe they don't like long-term research, because that, if we say we're working on a 10-year project that 10 years from now will be brilliant, maybe the politicians don't care. The politicians won't still be here 10 years from now. They'll have lost their election. So maybe these institutes can get very bureaucratic and also very obsessed on short-term funding. And also, productive junior researchers can be stifled by the bureaucracy being bossed around by someone who's been there for decades. So, what about the competitive grant model? Here, what the government does is issue grants. They set up an organisation like the Australian Research Council in Australia, which several times a year will set out a call for proposals. People can put in a proposal, please give us this much money so that we can do this piece of research, and that will be wonderful and revolutionise science and help Australia. And some panel, usually of other scientists, will read all these proposals and decide who gets the money and who doesn't. So a big advantage is accountability. You know that it's not some out-of-control bureaucracy doing whatever it wants. Everything that's being funded had to justify why it was funded, and governments like that. It stops researchers from being complacent. If you haven't done good research for a while, you're not going to get any more grants. Work harder, you slacker! It also, in some ways, avoids the bureaucracy because it means that new institutes can develop. So let's say a university without a big research group has a brilliant researcher, they can still get a grant and maybe build up that university or maybe even a private company can apply for these grants, a startup even. So it's not tied necessarily to the same few big old companies and universities, so it allows new organisations to come on. It's much more flexible. Drawbacks? Well, there's a huge overhead. Scientists, like in this picture, waste huge amounts of time applying for grants. I'm always amused when I start in first semester and students say, "Did you have a nice break?" Because in fact the deadline for applying for Australian Research Council grants is just before the start of semester. So for most scientists, late January, early February is the busiest time of the year because they're busy putting in these enormously long and bureaucratic grant applications to get their funding. And it's a great relief when semester comes along because the grant applications are gone and they can just relax and teach students. It's also very short term. You need grants all the time, and the grants typically for a few years only, maybe 3 years. If you're very lucky, you might get a 5-year grant, and so that encourages short-term research. After you've had a 3-year grant, you get to show at the end that you've achieved something with it. So you can't embark on an ambitious 10-year project funded by grants. Fluctuations make the career structure difficult. Remember we talked earlier about how there are lots of short-term jobs. Grants are a large part of why there are so many short-term grants. Let's say you get a bunch of money for 3 years, you can hire someone for 3 years. You can't hire someone for 10 years because the grant might run out and you might not get another one. When I first came to Australia, I was funded on a grant that had 1.5 years left to run. So all they could promise me was 1.5 years of funding. I then had to leave Australia. Luckily they got another grant that ran for another 2 years. But after that the money ran out, there was no more job there, I had to move somewhere else. It means the funding is very lumpy. Some years you get lots of money, some years you get nothing. Maybe you have to sack everybody when you've got no grant 1 year. Then you can't hire them back because they've all left. You can't support a family on the sort of income which is coming and going from year to year. And also maybe these are very conservative, partially because everyone has to get results, so they go for a sure thing project that's guaranteed a result rather than a risky one that might not give a result. And also you have to impress all your peers. You have to get through. The government doesn't know what's good or bad research. They can give general guidelines, but normally your grant application is being reviewed by a whole bunch of other scientists, which means you have to be nice to them. You have to do things they're going to like. You can't come up with, what everyone else said in this field is wrong. We're going to do something revolutionary that improves all those morons, that we've got a better way of doing things, because all those morons are the people going to decide whether you get funding. And for these grants, most grants in Australia, there's only like a 10% chance of getting funded. 90% of your applications are rejected, which can be soul destroying. It could be no fault of your own. Maybe grants get rejected for a paperwork technicality. So what can you do? All the methods which governments can use to improve science are flawed, some possibly fatally flawed. So there's a field called progress studies. People are trying to work out better ways to encourage research and development. This could be better ways to fund government. A famous example is DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a US military agency which has funded an incredible amount of incredibly productive research, from internet to self-driving cars, stealth technology. They have a very hands-on approach. They don't just give you the money and tell you to do the research. They've got a very highly skilled group of people in their agency who goes out and identifies things and runs competitions and works with people to develop proposals and tries to develop a competitive ecosystem. Maybe a much more active and well-funded research agency could do that. There are probably ways to help venture capital, maybe tax breaks for venture capital, changing the way capital gains tax works. In Australia, company directors are liable if a company goes bankrupt, whereas the US has very good bankruptcy laws. That means you can go bankrupt lots of times and still start a new company. There are drawbacks to that, but it also gives people a much more confidence to invest in risky things. Maybe there are ways to hand out grants that don't involve so much paperwork. But to my mind, the fundamental trouble is that none of this is a priority for most governments. It should be, because in the long run, developing research and development in the country is going to transform the economy and make us all richer. But governments don't tend to think long term. They've got an election to deal with in the next few months. The general public, they don't normally vote on, I'm going to vote Labour because they have better science policy. If you look at all the opinion polls, what people say they're going to determine what they vote for, science is not normally in the top 20. And most government people are not science trained. There are exceptions, but mostly they're lawyers by training. They've probably been persuaded that science is important, but it's fairly low down their priority list, so there aren't that many people thinking hard about things like how best can we actually encourage science and technology, which is a shame.